writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business, coming to you from Kobo's headquarters in Toronto. Hi everyone, welcome to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. I'm Stephanie, and in today's episode, our own Cristina Mendez, who I'm sure you guys remember from other episodes, sits down in the Kobo office for a Kobo in conversation with author Amanda Cupido, whose book is about podcasting. So Cristina, can you tell us a little bit more about the interview?
Yeah, it was really great. I got to sit down with Amanda and talk about her book, Let's Talk Podcasting. Now, Amanda is a very famous award-winning podcast producer, and this book is all about getting a podcast off the ground, whether you're an individual person or a company, all the things that you need to know about podcasting, everything you need to know about getting one started, marketing trends. I think it'll be really relevant to our KWL authors if you're looking for sort of a new way to reach out to your readers. This is a really great format that is on the rise, and this is a really great book to start with in terms of everything that you need to know to get a podcast off the ground.
And even if you're not interested in starting your own podcast, Amanda talks about a lot of interesting points about how podcasts have changed in the last 10 years.
Yeah, there's a lot of great information about sort of what podcasting looks like today, what it could look like tomorrow, and even just like marketing trends of, you know, who's listening to podcasts, why are they listening, and what sort of things are they also looking for. So it's all really great.
Yeah, so without further ado, here is the interview.
So a little background, I noticed that you started in radio and with journalism as a producer, and then eventually turned that into a career as a producer and everything else for award-winning podcasts. Yes. So the first thing I really wanted to ask you about was why podcasts?
So I kind of fell into it, which is funny. I loved radio since I was young and always was like the kid calling into radio stations trying to just get on air for 2 seconds to request a song. So when I started, and I went to school for journalism, and then I started, producing. I eventually was a reporter and news anchor in a variety of different markets, including in Toronto. And during that time, I had a lot of people, podcasting was starting to gain some traction, and I had some people coming up to me and just asking me on the side to produce podcasts. So a couple of my first ones, which I'm not even going to mention, they're a bit cringeworthy to listen to, they were produced just kind of on the side for thought leaders mostly that were wanting to just, get into the podcasting space. But as it started to evolve, I started to really enjoy it. I found that with radio, I was cutting to such specific times. And a lot of the times, my content was really based on the daily news headlines. And if I had produced a really great piece that I was proud of, but then something major happened in the news, that either got played once or just got thrown out and never played. And with podcasting, I found there was a lot more flexibility with what you could produce, and it lived on for longer. So I slowly started to kind of shift, and I now obsessed with it, loved it. I listen, I'm a podcast listener myself, but also producing it just really gives me, a great creative outlet as form of audio, which is what I've always loved.
And I noticed that you call yourself an audio storyteller quite a bit. And is that something that transitions from both radio and podcast as well?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that sometimes in the news world, we have this title reporter, and it's like the nitty gritty, the hard stuff. And like a storyteller, I really love to pay tribute to how much actually goes into telling a great story, especially when it comes to audio and the flexibility and the creativity you can have with that. So much that you can do. And so I do label myself that intentionally because I think it is a whole other genre of content.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting, different title. There's something about it that just sounds so warm when you hear it. You're like, audio storyteller. Yeah. It just sounds lovely.
And that's what podcasts are, right? It's really lovely, intimate, and it's really nice.
Going from radio through to podcasting, for you, what is the biggest difference between the two?
Yeah, the time thing was a real big piece, right? So now suddenly when I'm producing podcasts, I don't have to be like, I have to fill 5 minutes. And even if this doesn't deserve 5 minutes, I got to stretch this to fill 5 minutes, right? As a producer, especially. Whereas now with podcasting, I'm like, okay, this interview deserves this 5 minutes, we'll give it to them. But hey, if it doesn't, then we'll cut it shorter. And hey, this is actually really great, surprisingly. Let's make it longer. And so even with some of my series, you'll see each episode varies in length, and that's okay because I'm always really dictated by the content. And that's what should be driving the length of a piece, right? Does it deserve this amount of time?
I think that's so interesting because one thing that I've noticed in looking around for podcasts is how long should one be? Because there's some people who can get away with an hour and you're like, oh, this is totally fine. I can listen to you chatting. And then there are some that you're like, even at 20 minutes, you're like, no, I'm out.
Right.
I'm done.
And some people have in their mind, I I guess in the podcast landscape, some people say, oh, that half an hour time mark, under an hour is that ideal sweet spot. But I hate even answering the question, what's an ideal time of an episode? Because you really can't determine it. And again, an hour can fly by if it's great content for an hour, but it could also be cringeworthy if it's being stretched to be an hour. Yeah.
So for anyone in the audience who's like thinking of starting a podcast, I'm sure there's probably some people here with it taking off or thinking of doing their own. Outside of purchasing Let's Talk Podcasting,
yes.
What do you think the first most important step is for them to take?
I think what I love to say is to really listen to podcasts. And because before I even started doing a real deep delve on production, I listened to a lot, and that really then dictated how I produced. And I found that, oh, this really worked in this context. I'm gonna just clock that in the back of my head. And I was able to kind of take best practices from a variety of different places and put it together to making some of the pieces I've made. And so listening a lot is really important, and not feeling like you have the confines of having to do a chat cast, which is when, two people are sitting down, or a round table of people sitting down. That's usually people's instinctual go-to. I want to make a podcast, we're gonna have people down and record. But like, there's so many different ways of and formats that you could embrace. And so sometimes a one-person show is really beneficial depending on the content and audience you're trying to target. Sometimes a chat cast does work, but it doesn't need to be the whole thing. Maybe it's just part of it and coupled with something else. Sometimes short vignettes that are just 5 minutes or 3 minutes long, and creating a series with that ends up really working. So really I say just first and foremost, be mindful of what content you want to share and what's the best way of sharing it. And don't just instinctually go to that chat cast, which is what we hear a lot of.
You sort of list out all the different genres and types of podcasts you can have. Do you have a preference in just listening that you like to listen to the most?
Well, I love journalistically, like slickly produced styled pieces, especially because that's what I tend to produce myself. But there are some great chat casts that I love, just, really intentional ones that, are specifically choosing that style because it works the best. But I am really all over the map. I listen to it. And also part of my job is to just listen to what's out there and get a holistic view of what the landscape is looking like. So I find that half my listening is strategic listening, where I'm just trying to explore, and half of it is because of my go-to podcast that I just love to keep coming back to.
I feel like you'd be the best person to go to for podcast recommendations. Are there some, from a personal standpoint, that you're like, oh, I love listening to these?
My go-tos are Modern Love from New York Times, which is, again, that format, helped influence some of the pieces I've produced, where, for those of you who don't know, they take the Modern Love section of the New York Times, and it's a series of essays that people submit about love stories. And then they hire an actor to do a read of it, and then they soundscape it really, really beautifully. And so it's kind of this in-between of, it's not really an audio book style, but it's not like written as a script. It's still an essay that's being read, but then they really bring in a lot of beautiful soundscaping. And so, for instance, I met the audio engineer on that, and he was saying that when they mention in an essay, oh, I was at the corner of whatever, 5th Street and 31st, they'll actually go to that corner and get the audio from that corner and then lay it underneath as the bed, and not just getting random cityscape sounds, right? They really are intentional with their sound ups and music choices, which I think is important and allows it to really flourish. So that's one that I love to go to. And then everything from Gimlet is incredible. So Gimlet's out of the US, and their original series was called Startup, and so that's a good go-to that I love keep checking back in on. And so it was very meta. Their first season was about Alex Bloomberg starting Gimlet, and they followed his journey in that, and now every season they profile a different business. So those are kind of the two I always just keep coming back to.
I saw Startup in your book, and I was like, okay, subscribing to this.
Yes. Did you listen?
Really cool. Not yet, but I have it to go.
You have to.
I'm like too behind on so many other
I know,
ones.
it's hard. There's a lot out there.
The common theme, there's just so many out there.
There's so many, yeah.
But you talk a lot about how, despite there being so many, there are a couple of key areas that need more voices in them. What are some of the areas that you think could use a bit more in podcasts in terms of content?
Yeah, so we know based on looking at what's out there already that the voices of the really young and the really old tend to not really get leveraged as much as they could. Just recently, though, we are starting to see the really young getting more of a focus. So podcasts even featuring kids and for kids. huge space that places like NPR are investing in. I know for a fact CBC now just told me, the executive producer said that they're going to be investing in. And just because we know that kids love audio, you know, engaging with audio, Sharon Lois and Bram. And so being able to take the creativity of a podcast and even just creating new worlds, some of them are just so fantastic the way they're put together. And so that's a space where I think is going to expand and should expand, because it is lacking at the moment.
Yeah, that one seems really interesting, the idea of podcasts for kids, because parents are always looking for free content.
Right.
They can keep their kids busy for a little bit of time, and especially if they can listen to it too.
Exactly, that's it. It's making sure that they can listen and enjoy as well, right? It's kind of the Shrek of podcasting, right? The kids love Shrek, but the adults also love Shrek. And so making a podcast that parents are also learning from and adults can enjoy, but kids are totally entertained by. It's a win-win.
Talking a bit more about like starting a podcast and setting one up, are there any roadblocks you've noticed consistently everyone has whenever they try to start one?
I think it's different for every person. Some people, like, the roadblock is right off the bat, where they're like, I don't know what to do, I don't know where to start, and then they start recording, and they have like hours of audio, and they're coming to me being like, what do I do with all of this? It's like, so sometimes it's actually just taking a beat before you start and really thinking through what you want to accomplish, who are you trying to target, and doing that effectively. But then sometimes I find it actually comes down to the editing, right? So then they have a lot of audio that they've recorded, but then they just don't know what to do with it. And so I like to say, you'll figure out very quickly what feeds you and what depletes you. And so what part do you really enjoy doing? What part do you really have an aptitude for? And then what part might you need a bit of help with? So I market myself as an end-to-end producer because I can do the full spectrum of a production. But at the same time, I very much recognize that if I'm going to hire someone else on, it's going to be an audio engineer to really do that finite mixing and editing piece. And so just acknowledging where are your strengths. So my strength is in storytelling. My strength is in building a narrative and the strategic part of it. So when you're going about this, you can try to wrap your head around everything, but it would be great to have help in the areas that deplete you.
And not to bring up bad memories,
okay,
but have there been any podcasts that you've worked on or maybe it's even gone out and at the end you're like, this just did not work. Like, we tried, but it's not right.
So there's little moments throughout every podcast, and just like anything you produce artistically, you could be working at this forever. So there's podcasts, even parts of the World Vision Canada podcast, which I'm very proud of. It's called A Pitch for Change. But there's like random moments where I'm like, that audio leveling, it bothered me then, it bothers me now, right? Like just these little moments. But you'll never get something to being 100% perfect, and being okay with that as a creative. I think that's a through line just beyond podcasting as well. But also my earlier podcast, like I produced one in 2005 and it's definitely cringeworthy, but I was experimenting in the space and I was trying different things. My recording wasn't the best. I was editing in Audacity, which is free. So I was limited though by what I could do, but that's part of the whole journey, right? And I think a lot of podcasts, even just like TV shows in their first season or their pilot episode, tend to be quite cringe. The same goes for podcasts, and even some of the biggest and best ones. Modern Love, if you listen to season 1, episode 1 versus where they're at now, very different the way they're formatting it. And that's just because they pivoted along the way, learning what worked, what didn't, and then adjusted. And that's an important part of it.
And do you find you have to re-listen to things that you've done and made quite often?
Well, in the process of it, I listen to it like ad nauseum. Yeah. And then even after it's published, I will start to listen from different speakers just to see how it sounds from an iPad and how it sounds in my car when it's through Bluetooth. But you can really go down that hole real far and lose yourself. So it gets to a point where I actually just stop listening to it because you'll just drive yourself insane. So yeah, for the most part, it's really when it's about to be published, and right when it's published, I'll do a lot of listening, but then after that, I have to step away. Yeah.
We have some people from our QA team here, and I'm just trying to imagine Pitt saying like, hey, we're on your podcast, can you listen to it on all these different kinds of speakers so we can make sure that it sounds good?
Sounds great, and it like probably will not sound great on one of them, and that's okay. You can't make all speakers happy, but yeah, you gotta just try your best.
So you talked about 2 of really, really strong podcasts you've produced before, the one for World Vision, and as well one for New Lens Travel.
Yes.
But one thing you didn't talk about in your book that I noticed you've done was also Her Story, which is your award-winning podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that one? What's it about, and the sort of background in making one?
Sure. So that one was produced in 2015, and it was produced out of an agency that I used to work for called MediaFace. So they were actually a video production agency that I was working on doing videos, and I was doing a lot of voicing and video production. But this was all during the time Serial had just come out, right? It was 2014. I was working at this agency, and I I made this pitch to build out a branded podcast vertical for this agency. And we were small, we were a startup. And so luckily the founder, Lisa Bragg, was great and encouraged me to kind of explore the space, do a bit more research. And I ended up building out an entire branded podcast vertical, maybe a little bit before its time, right? In 2014, people were a little bit hesitant to put marketing dollars behind a branded podcast. But part of that was her saying, you know what, then we should actually own a podcast series ourselves. If we're going to start selling it, we better have one that we could call our own. And so this was a great example of a branded podcast. It was branded on behalf of MediaFace, but it wasn't selling video production. It was an example of a podcast, but there was no hard sell of a podcast. It was just taking some of our bigger picture, brand pieces that we really aligned with as a company and translating it into a mini series. And so we were in a digital space, in a video production space, which was typically very skewed towards men. And so we had a female founder and our entire staff was mostly women. And so we thought that would be something great to highlight. So the series was called Her Story, a podcast about Canadian women owning it. And so what we ended up doing was featuring either some people that had been in some of our videos in other capacities, but really doing a deep delve on their story and highlighting a different woman tied to a bigger theme with each episode. And so we ended up highlighting some fantastic stories, like a Paralympian who was almost 100% blind and her journey with that. We featured Deborah DiGiovanni, who is a comedian and talking about females in the comedy space. So we really got a deep delve on some of these like meatier topics and highlighting these great women. And so the podcast was launched in conjunction with Huffington Post, so all of those episodes got published there. And then, yes, it was the recipient of the 2015 Marcom Award, the Gold Award, which was really great and really solidified what we were doing and the direction we were going.
And I love it, too, if anyone has a chance to check it out. It's only 5 parts. There's something nice about an audiobook podcast that you can finish.
Yes.
Like an audiobook.
Zip right through it.
Yeah, sometimes it's a bit daunting. You're like, okay, there's 3 seasons of this. It's never going to end ever.
Yeah.
So I'll just start listening whenever I can.
Yeah.
So that was nice. I also really liked in your book, and about this, a lot of it has some Canadian facts.
Yes.
Because so much of this stuff is all American-based, and you just have to assume the Canadian market is similar.
Mm-hmm.
But this book has some actual core numbers about what the Canadian market is like.
Yes.
Do you find you get mostly Canadian people reaching out to you, or do you ever get a chance to do a lot with the U.S.?
Yeah, so I found, number one, that's what I really wanted to bring to my book, was that there was no published writing that was factoring in these Canadian numbers. And it's also because we haven't even been tracking the numbers in Canada for very long. So highlighting the few numbers that we did have, I think, was really important. And it does follow the trends of the US, but there was some specific Canadian numbers that were interesting. For instance, that Canadians want more Canadian content, but we don't really necessarily have the means to getting it, which is why we're taking in a lot of US content. The podcast industry is so small, and so even those who are really into the space cross borders, it's all a really small community. So I was lucky enough to be actually on a scholarship to attend a conference last year called Work It, and it's a female podcasting conference hosted by WNYC. So even though hosted from New York radio station, it was held in LA, and it brought 600 women podcasters together. And so that was a really great opportunity for me to network with some of the women on the other side of the border and hear about some of the work they're doing and some of the dreams and vision they have for where podcasting is going to go for both Canada and the US. And so interestingly enough, I met someone from Midroll, and this is a company that is not only creating original content now, but originally started as just selling ads as that in-between person between advertisers and podcasters. And so their most notable podcast is WTF with Mark Maron. He was one of their first and has now blown up, but they're the ones kind of doing the ad placement for him. But she was saying, they have advertisers coming to them dying for Canadian content and they don't have much. CBC is obviously really in its own realm and is not going to go to something like Midroll. So other than CBC, who do they have to work with? It wasn't very many people. And they were saying, we're even taking on Canadian podcasts that aren't meeting our minimum number of listeners that we would typically take on, but we were taking them on just because we have such a need from advertisers, and so we actually have some flexibility in that. I found that very interesting and really inspiring for Canadians who maybe want to delve into the space and want to have those cross-border connections. They're definitely able to.
Well, I have one more question, then I'm going to throw it to the floor for anybody else who has any, so start thinking of them now so you're ready to go. Outside of kids podcast, which sounds amazing. Is there anything else that you think could be a next big thing coming up in podcasts?
Yes. So I like to say branded podcasts, huge. And this was, again, because more and more we're seeing marketing stats on the effectiveness of branded podcasts and brand recall. And so it's just blowing, like banner ads, web ads, even just like ad spots, traditional ad spots on the radio. It's like blowing these stats out of the water. People are able to not only really have the brand recall, but they are buying things based on listening to branded content. And especially when a host does like a read or incorporates that content into their podcast. For instance, I brought up WTF with Mark Maron. So his producer was speaking at the conference and was saying that they did a survey of their listenership, and they found that 80% of their listeners had purchased something that Mark had mentioned on the podcast. Like, these are crazy, crazy high numbers. So branded podcasts for sure. And we just saw like Interact just launched a podcast through Gimlet, which is big. And we're seeing a lot of that trend. Second thing is live events and conferences. We have the Toronto Hot Docs that has their conference. There's one in BC and one in Edmonton that have crept up in the last year or so. But I think conferences and bringing people together in a space to talk about podcasting is going to come increasingly popular. And live events where we're seeing podcasts performed live, sometimes with, live musicians playing the music, and there's, the host doing a live read. We're selling out theaters right now. Would not be surprised if we're selling out stadiums soon. And then the final piece is delving into that 360 audio space, where we, just like what we saw with video, virtual reality and 360 video becoming really big. There is the capability of doing 360 audio. It hasn't necessarily gotten into the podcast space yet, but imagine being, with virtual reality, listening and sitting in one spot, but feeling like, something's far away and coming closer to you, or something's coming from above you. This will probably also evolve as wearable technology becomes more sophisticated, but even augmented reality, where you might be in a room and having a headset on and being able to interact and like have a choose your own adventure sort of audio experience, where you're walking through a room and you can hear different conversations based on where you're standing and based on the headset you're wearing. So, that's just maybe a bit far-sighted, but I'm sure it's to come.
As someone who listens to true crime and murder podcasts, sounds absolutely terrifying.
Right.
I'm sure it would be great. I'd be there, but the whole time, I'd be terrified the whole time.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have anything they want to ask? If anybody's thinking about starting a podcast, I think this is a great time to get some advice.
I guess, so you mentioned areas which are kind of underrepresented. Like there's not as much representation would be with children, and you went a little bit into that. But I'm also curious, when you said for those who are aging, or for spaces for the elderly, that interests me a lot, because I know sometimes there's so much associated with memory loss and things like that. So it sounds like it could be a space where it really stimulates people, especially also if you think about retirement and stuff like that.
Yeah.
How there's so much more time, and how to continue to engage and stimulate a population once they're not working or whatever.
Yeah, there's two sides to this. One is that, an older generation, they really love audio, right? And there's kind of a throwback to them that they're, originally engaging with content through the radio, right? So they understand it, they feel comfortable with it. There actually is quite an appetite for them to listen. But at the same time, I also think there's a real opportunity to get, and this is a side project I haven't even said out loud yet, so get it on the record here first, but
this is exciting.
One of the projects I actually want to start is pro bono work with helping to capture memories of those who are not necessarily in 100% stable mindset and maybe are losing their memory and maybe subject to dementia or just near their end of their life. And I find that even just as humans, when we're with people in our lives that are aging and maybe we're feeling like we're losing them, we hang on to voicemails, we try to record their ideas, and creating video kind of seems a bit intrusive. You're not getting them at their best and it almost feels wrong. But I think audio creates this amazing space to really honor them without being too intrusive, but really capture their essence maybe right before they go. And so I'm looking to actually launch something where I'm doing a monthly or bi-monthly sort of project where I'm able to go in and do some recording for people and create a little snapshot of a story or a memory that we can slickly produce and make available, as a memory for people. Yeah.
It sounds like something that would be absolutely beautiful and then gut-wrenching.
Yeah.
This is something available for people to listen to. I'm just imagining people on, the bus heading to work and
just
just
crying.
like bawling.
But imagine just having like the wisest, compilation of lessons learned in a life and putting them together. And I mean, some of them I'm sure would need to be private and kept private. But if I could pull together some, like even just a little mini series of some like final thoughts, final words of wisdom, I just think it'd be really beautiful. So, yeah.
So on a very practical side of things, if you, or rather I or us, are starting off and we have like a limited amount of money to invest, what is the most useful thing to start off with?
Well, and are you saying you're starting from scratch?
Absolute amateur beginner.
Because you guys have the equipment, so you wouldn't need to invest in that, right? Are you saying we as in Kobo?
I'm more like we as individuals.
Okay. Gotcha. So it really also comes down to where your skill sets lie, right? So maybe if you are feeling like editing is that space that you really don't know anything about, it might be best to be investing in someone who can edit. So you're not pulling your hair out and then not even being happy with the final product. But at a bare bones base, I think that getting some sort of rhythm with how you're recording and what you're using is very valuable. And if you have good audio, you can then do a lot with it. Whereas if you're recording into a computer and it's not great and then you're going to invest in an editor, like that's not money well spent, right? So it kind of just depends on where you're at and where your skill sets lie. So I think that recording strong audio, however you're going to get that, and maybe you do invest a little bit of money into that, getting someone who can actually put it together. Because again, if you have great audio, but then it's not put together well, it's hard to make it successful and feel proud of it. So maybe it's going to go a little bit there. And then really making sure that you have great pieces around it. So thumbnail art, as simple as that might sound, might be worth investing in a graphic designer, because there are a lot of podcasts that have actually just become popular because their thumbnail art looked really cool. And one producer I spoke to was from the podcast Call Your Girlfriend. And they did a survey, an informal survey of their audiences right when they started off, being like, how did you find out about it? And a large majority have said, I just clicked because the thumbnail art looked so cool. And so not forgetting that those little pieces even are really important. And so maybe that's where you invest if you don't have those skills, right? But I think it's taking a holistic view of what you have to bring to the table and then finding those pockets of what you don't have and investing there.
What I appreciate as well is in the book, there are specific examples of like, this is a good microphone for this. These are the directions that you needed to do depending on what kind of podcast you're going to do.
Yeah.
So that was really helpful too. It wasn't just a vague sort of idea of look for something that does this. You're like, no, this brand will help you with this thing that you need.
Yeah, and it's also knowing what you need, right? So some people are like, I'm going to buy a microphone, but they didn't actually think about what format they're going to do their podcast. So even this Zoom H4, right? This is great for two people, but the moment you put a third person, not great, right? So you're buying this thing and then you're like having round tables and it doesn't work as well. So really, I think step one is figuring out what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and then investing accordingly.
And that's something Steph is going to have to deal with when she goes to edit this.
Yeah.
And we can't hear anything from this side.
Good luck.
I've been listening to podcasts for a really long time, like since before they were on Spotify, which feels like when that happened recently, I was overjoyed.
Yeah.
I'm a tech person. I'm always curious about the technology side of things. What do you see as like the next big thing for podcasting? Like we've used just on websites, download from iTunes onto your like iPod.
Yeah.
Now you have things like Spotify, Apple Music, etc.
Yes.
What do you think like the next step?
Well, I think, and it's a great question. I think specifically with social media, we're going to see a shift in how social platforms deal with audio, because right now they don't deal with audio very well at all. But we have people wanting to share podcasts, even specific times within a podcast that they want to share. We don't really have that capability right now. So I know that Facebook was dabbling in micro podcasting, as they called it, so ability to record right into Facebook and have that kind of like a status or an update or a post, which is really cool. But I also think next level would also make the sharing capabilities of audio be a little bit more user-friendly and intentional around sharing that piece. And also at the same time, just in general, I think there needs to be some more consolidated places where someone can see a list of all the podcasts, right? Like it's so fragmented right now. It's crazy that we don't have one place yet. And I mean, I'm not the person to develop it. Maybe someone here is, or someone listening. But even a Rotten Tomatoes of podcasts. Why isn't there not one place where I could go just look up all the reviews, right? I have to go to iTunes, look up those reviews, and like it's just so fragmented. So I think very soon we're going to start seeing these things getting consolidated to have one place that you can go and get everything, hopefully.
I've got a big question. what do you think the future is for revenue generation if someone wants to make this a career? So you've got NPR that's doing public funding, you've got Gimlet that's doing sort of VC funding, and you've got Radiotopia that's doing sort of crowdfunding.
Yep.
Where do you think that's going?
Yeah, I think we're going to start seeing more and more networks. And so like something like Radiotopia, they still are really trying to promote the grassroots production of podcasts too, right? So Ear Hustle, which is one of their most successful podcasts, that won a contest, right? That was just being produced on their own and it was submitted. So I definitely see there's going to be a lot more contesting so that grassroots productions can be brought into these networks and leveraged, because these networks don't have all the answers, and I think they know that. And also that definitely will also help with lifting the voices of those typically underrepresented. So we just saw Google put out their podcast contest, which closed a week and a half ago, trying to lift the voices of those underrepresented, right? And it was hoping that your team and or your content was trying to do that. And they were offering $40,000 for each podcast. That was going to be one of their selected winners, and provide mentorship around that. Amazing. And I foresee that continuing. But I do think, especially in Canada, we don't have very many of these networks right now. In the US, and I just think we are going to follow. That's one area where we will follow the US. So we have, for instance, Pineapple Street Media in the US. Might not know the name, but you probably would know Missing Richard Simmons, the podcast, Lena Dunham's podcast, produced from Pineapple Street Media, right? And so these networks are now growing audiences, and then when they add on a new podcast, they're not trying to start from zero with building an audience. They already have this audience base that they can leverage. And so in Canada, we have the CBC, and that's pretty much it. And we have Rogers and Chorus, who have started their own network, so to say, but that is really, it's mainstream. It's very mainstream, but I think there is this like in-between world where we're going to start seeing these networks come together and maybe bring in some of these grassroots podcasts and start to really leverage them that way.
Do you have, because you listen to a lot of podcasts and work on them constantly, are there any mistakes that you see, like common mistakes that we should try and avoid if we're making a podcast?
Great question. I think everyone has their own, it's subjective. I have my own cringe moments with podcasts. So number one, the introduction, the opening to a podcast needs to be strong. And I stress this. I find that a lot of people end up forgetting to introduce their hosts. Crazy to me. You need to introduce who's speaking. Some big names, I'm not going to call them out, but there are some big names who do not introduce their hosts off the top, and it's like, I don't know how that made it through. So really introduce the host. This is an intimate experience. People are listening in their ears. They need to know who's talking to them. And not having these like long droning out introductions. Like we want to get to the goods. And so if you have to spend a minute explaining what the podcast is about, then you know what? You don't even know what your podcast is about then. Like, you got to be able to say it in 1 to 2 sentences max, right? And so I think that's something that's commonly overlooked, and people write these really long intros, or they wing the intro and it's 3 minutes in and we haven't gotten to the content yet. I can't handle it. And I will tune out. And they actually say, if someone makes it past 10 seconds of a podcast, they're likely to stick through the whole thing. And if those 10 seconds are very valuable. So like use them wisely. That would be my number one tip. And you might have to workshop that sentence like you would with a startup in an elevator pitch. Workshop it, test it on people. Do you understand what this podcast is about? And that sometimes takes the most amount of time for me in my production, is like getting that first sentence to be bang on. And we're going to say that sentence at the beginning of every episode, so better be damn good.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for coming today. This has been so exciting, being so open.
Thank you.
And I honestly can't wait now to hear for this future podcast about just like really the saddest stories ever.
Yeah.
But like just so sweet. I'm already anticipating like sitting at work and just tears running down my face.
Yeah, stay tuned.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody for coming.
Thank you.
So we hope you enjoyed Christina's interview with Amanda. Please make sure to check out the Kobo Writing Life blog for a write-up about the episode.
If you like that episode, please make sure to rate and subscribe.
And let us know if you want us to talk to someone and you think that would be interesting on the podcast. You can email us at writinglife@kobo.com, and we'd love to hear from listeners. And we hope you're having a lovely 2019 so far. So until next time, thank you so much for listening. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we provide insights and stories from leaders and experimenters in the world of self-publishing.
If you want even more information about growing your Kobo sales, check out our blog or find us on social.
And if you're just finding us and ready to start your self-publishing journey today, sign up for free at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing!